Hi, and welcome to this introduction to our Lean Service Operations Management Program for team leaders and mid-level managers. It's a program we've developed in conjunction with Technical University of Dublin, and this is a quick overview of the three-module program. Lean Service Operations Management is basically the science and disciplines of cohering the organizational performance of service and knowledge work organizations. And cohering is a word that we'll come back to and look at in a little bit more detail. And in today's digital age, it's really important to understand the complexity of service organizations and how they can be managed more effectively and efficiently. What's the problem we're trying to solve? Well, the problem we're trying to solve is that if you look at service productivity, it's pretty poor. It generally runs at about 1/10 that of the manufacturing sectors. And if you look at the picture on the left, you'll see an old style typing pool. And if you look at the picture on the right, you'll see a modern contact center. And to be honest, there's not a huge amount of difference when you look at the management technology behind it, even though the underlying technology has improved, the production technology. Whereas if you look at the manufacturing sector, you have on the bottom left there, you have the old style assembly line. Whereas if you look at the modern manufacturing facility today, it's completely different. And productivity in those sectors are 10 times what they are in the services sector. So why is that? And that's what this program addresses and helps team leaders and mid-level managers really get hold of these challenges and move the needle, as they say, on the productivity curve when it comes to service and knowledge work. So at Expertivity Technologies, we've identified 3 core technologies that really have got to come together to deliver this high level of productivity. The first is management technology. Now, the word technology in associated with management is not often used, but in reality, management is a technology. It's a set of methods on how do we, the what and the why of what it is that we're going to do. We look at process technology. Process technology is the general how. How are we going to get things done, particularly when we look at horizontal processes, which are particularly important in the service and knowledge work sector. And finally, then there's digital technology, which is the digital how. So traditionally, organizations may have relied on manual processes or semi-manual processes, but there's no excuse now for not having a fully fledged digital organization at this point in time. And really the role of the management then is to bring these 3 strands together into a coherent strategy. And this is what this program tries to address. So why is it that, that service and knowledge work is more complicated or is more difficult to affect productivity in? Well, one of the reasons is that the traditional management methods that have evolved over the years have kind of assumed that organizations are mechanistic, that they're kind of cogs and wheels, and what's known as the law of cause and effect kind of applies. And while that broadly is true in the traditional sectors, the manufacturing sectors, that's not the case in the modern service and knowledge work organization. You see this now in terms of the traditional manufacturing organization. These organizations are complicated. And there is a significant difference between what we call complicatedness, which is driven by cause and effect, and complexity, which is really the world of the service and knowledge work. And in fact, so these organizations are, while they're complicated, they can be broken up, transported to different locations, put back together again. And that's not something you can do with a service organization, as we'll see. And in fact, as an example, I once worked with an American multinational. And when I went to visit their campus in the UK, I was surprised to see an American fire hydrant in their on the premises. And when I asked about it, they said, no, we copied everything. It was just easier to copy everything rather than it was to change 1 or 2 items. So as a result, even the American fire hydrant came, even though it doesn't fit in with the local fire station rules and so on. So when we look at a service organization, what is a service organization? Well, a service organization is a network. It's a complex network of people that are constantly interacting and adapting to different contexts. People often go home. When they come back the next day, something may have happened in their family. There could have been an illness. So the context is constantly changing, and the environment in which people work is constantly changing. So that degree of complexity needs a different set of rules and approaches to manage and bring a coherence to workers in that situation. The typical and traditional organization structure is that hierarchy of work teams. And we'll talk, a little bit about the difference between work teams and teams. Work teams are typically have a permanence. They're going to be there for quite a while, whereas your traditional project team, for example, is there just for the duration of the project. So we'll talk about work teams in this context. And there, in that hierarchy, you've got bunches of people, all of whom who work for the various managers. And ultimately, that has got to come together in some kind of a coherent whole. When we look at a single team, what defines a team is its ability to collaborate. Otherwise, you just got a group of people. So collaboration is going to be a strong theme of this program. And then when we look at how that team is cohered, there's typically a team leader, or at least there's shared leadership often amongst the team as to who is the leader at what point in time. But most importantly, to collaborate, teams need data and information. Like, what are we going to collaborate about? What are we going to collaborate on? And teams typically have shared goals and objectives. So the data to be able to share those goals and objectives and work together as a team is a key requirement. And we'll be talking about how to create that data, how to find that data, how to develop that data during the course of the program. Generally, there's more than one team. So when you look at a number of teams, then the next stage is to look at the role of the mid-level manager. And how the mid-level manager contributes to collaboration across a broader span. So within the team, you're talking about collaboration within the team. The mid-level manager's got to look at inter-team collaboration. And again, this is going to be a key requirement. And there's different data that's needed and different information that's needed to be able to do this effectively. So work teams can either perform the same tasks, in which case that's really an issue where there may be too many people in a team and it has to be broken across multiple team leaders. Or more commonly, it's where there's different tasks, and for a variety of reasons, the organization has broken the teams down into specialist teams where the specific tasks are occurred. So for example, the finance teams look after finance, and even with finance, you might have an accounts payable team, an accounts receivable team, and so on. So when we look at that, then the question is, how do those multiple teams collaborate, particularly if they're from different functions, so sales and marketing and finance, accounting, or whatever it might be? How do they need to be able to do that? So it's key that there is some kind of a coherent structure that allows people to be able to join up their thinking and achieve some higher level common goal. So this is what we really mean about cohering the team to have some kind of a picture. So if the analogy here on the screen is one of a jigsaw puzzle, then people need to know, what does that picture look like when the jigsaw puzzle is assembled. And again, we need data to be able to support that. So the definition of coherence from the Cambridge Dictionary is when the parts of something fit together in a natural or reasonable way. So fit together is the key requirement for a team to work, for an organization to work. And that kind of inter-team coordination and mid-level manager coordination is key to the second module that we'll be looking at in the program. So an inter-team collaboration defines an organization. Like, the key is in the word organize. So again, we're looking at a whole organization collaborating to try and achieve some kind of a shared goal and objective. And that's really what service operations management is, and it's the challenge that it addresses and that it solves. One of the key things we'll be talking about is demand and capacity management. And this is going to be really key for each and every team. And then we aggregate the teams, the organization's demand and capacity. How do you resource and have in place the capability to be able to deal with the workload demands that are presented to the organization? Because one part of the organization, typically the sales and marketing teams, are out there drumming up business, trying to encourage people to contact us. And then typically there's a part of the organization, often called the operations teams, whose job is to manage that workload and be able to deliver the products and services. So the challenge from a demand perspective in service organizations is you've got a variety of different inputs. You've got phone calls, you've got emails, you've got other teams maybe in communication over an internal system, perhaps a case management system. You may just have old traditional post and letters and so on. And all of that together is work that requires processing. And to be able to do that effectively, we need to be able to take those volumes of activity. So we might know we have 100 emails in, we might know we received 20 letters or whatever it is, but we need to turn that into some kind of an estimation of time. So looking at that work and say, well, how many hours worth of expertise are we going to need to be able to process those? So one of the first challenges is to be able to convert those volumes into times, and that's something we'll be looking at. And then the second step is really saying, well, even though people generate a lot of work, not all of that work is value added. And there's a term known as failure demand, for example. So failures in the system are coming in and creating work. So we need to isolate that and look at that as distinct from the value added demand, which is where we're delivering value to customers. And then what kind of service level have we committed to? How are we going to be able to balance that workload demand and capacity to be able to deliver on the service levels that we've committed to? And fundamentally, that's looking at the challenge that, demand is relatively fixed, which is the, capacity is relatively fixed, which is the red line in the chart here. Whereas the demand typically varies significantly. You might get 50 emails today and 150 emails tomorrow, and so on. So that's one of the big challenges that operations management is trying to reconcile. How do you deal with this? So the challenge really is, how do you do that? How do we look at the variability within the volumes that come in every day, the variability within the task? How long does it take to do one email as distinct from another email? So that's a big challenge. And then looking at the trends over time to be able to see, well, if we get 100 emails every Monday, is it reasonable to assume that next Monday we might get 100 emails? So our ability to be able to forecast the future is an absolutely strong measure of how well we understand the complexity of the environment in which we're working. And if we can do that to some reasonable degree of accuracy, then we have a real good handle on the business system, as we might call it. And in that context, it's generally never as good as we want. So therefore, the opportunity without those information and insights to be able to improve how we perform over time and ultimately meet and improve the customer needs. Teams will also get an opportunity to use advanced service operations management platforms such as Salesforce. And in this short clip from a Salesforce training video, you can see the work allocation module, which helps teams or individuals allocate work amongst the team so that it's allocated to people who have the available capacity and the right skill. Another important challenge that we're looking at is the use of the average. And averages can be very useful in certain situations, but can be extraordinarily misleading in other situations. And it's often referred to as the tyranny of the average. So for example, if we had 10 people in a room and they were, for example, 4 feet tall, and another 10 people and they were 8 feet tall, then the average in the room would be 6 foot tall. But in reality, there'd be nobody there who is actually 6 foot tall. So it's important to remember that an average is kind of a made-up number. It can be useful in certain circumstances, but it can be extraordinarily misleading, particularly where there's a high degree of variability involved. So we'll be looking at that and how to deal with that challenges. One of the interesting things that we need to cope with and get to grips with in the services sector is that even though there's a huge amount of variability, we can manage that variability down, and we will talk about things like the cone of uncertainty. How do you start wide in terms of the variability that's there? So, for example, you might have an email that some of them are 60 minutes long, and some of them are 5 minutes long, and there's a bunch of things in between that are a bit of everything. So, how do you narrow that cone of uncertainty down to a certain degree of predictably, where you can begin to forecast the future and say, well, that bunch of emails, for example, will only take approximately 5 minutes, but this other bunch of emails is going to take 20 minutes. So we'll be going through that and showing some tools and techniques to be able to deal with variability and variation and build greater ability to predict the future, which is an important aspect in service operations management. And then wrapped around the mechanics of that is the challenge then around the fact that service organizations are populated by people, and people are not machines. So there's a whole variety of challenges around the soft skills that are necessary for people to develop, and also protocols and behaviors that people are prepared to accept and tolerate. So I'll be looking at things like relational coordination and teaming from the work by people like Jody Gittell and Amy Edmondson. Looking at psychological safety, again from Amy Edmondson. And this is really key. And the real test of the culture of an organization is the ability to be able to manage failure in an open fashion, and not develop a blame culture, but actually develop a learning and adaptable and an adaptation culture. So I'll be talking about that in quite a bit of detail, particularly during module 1 and module 2. We'll also be looking at what are the key kind of behaviors that high-performing organizations develop in their teams. So looking at, unity of purpose, the alignment of goals, their clear responsibilities. Individuals carrying their own weight can often be a sensitive subject in service organizations. We'll also be looking at then structured collaboration. So on the soft skill side of things, looking at how do you build a culture and a set of behaviors that encourages people to be able to collaborate. But even in a situation where you have a huge amount of people committed to collaboration, you need structure. You need systems that act as a framework for people. So we'll be looking at things like end-to-end processes, and a really useful tool, sometimes called a SIPOC. I prefer to call it a SIPOR, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So the SIPORs are those important things that connect the different links in a chain, and usually those links are teams, the links between the different teams. So in this particular example, you've a bunch of people, maybe a person on the left making a 999 call comes through to a contact center agent who takes the initial call, moves it on to a nurse who decides it's too complex for her to deal with separately, moves it on to a doctor, and a doctor may call in a consultant to participate in a call. And ultimately the person at the end is the person who initiated the call, which is the the customer or the patient. So typically a service in which is generally delivers services to people involves the customer at one end and the customer at the other end ultimately receiving the service, and the productivity of that process and the customer experience in that process are hugely influenced by how that process is designed. And that's something we'll come to a little bit later on. So SIPOC is kind of an acronym for S is for sender. So who or what is sending the inputs, which are the things that are actually processed. So somebody somewhere sends inputs, and those inputs get processed through a variety of steps, and that ultimately develops an output of some description, which is then in turn sent back to a receiver. And as I say, in service organizations, often the sender and the receiver are the same person, which is one of the reasons I prefer the SIPOR acronym rather than the SIPOC, which generally refers to, suppliers and customers. But in this particular case, the supplier and the customer can often be the same person. And if we look at that, the previous example was a chain of people in a process. If we look at it, particularly now with automation, where you may have bots or whatever in there, you can improve the productivity of a process by significant levels of automation. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that the customer experience is going to meet or achieve the level that's expected, even though the productivity might grow significantly. So balancing that challenge between higher productivity while maintaining or improving customer experience and customer services is one of the key challenge of the service operations management skill set. So one of the key things we'll be doing during the program is talk about the importance of operational definitions, and that's particularly important in the services sector because there are very many different words and terms that are often used interchangeably or are sometimes are misused in the wrong context. So for example, process output is what the process was designed to deliver, whereas process outcomes is what the customer experienced. And they're not always the same thing, although sometimes the words are used interchangeably. Process efficiency is the same outputs with less inputs. Whereas process effectiveness is that the customer experience is what the customer expects, so have we effectively met the customer's expectations? Productivity is more output for the same or lower input. So productivity and efficiency are slightly different in the sense that efficiency is less inputs, whereas productivity, you can change either. You can have lower inputs for the same output or the same inputs for greater outputs. Service quality with a small q is where outputs conform to a specification. Now, unfortunately, service organizations are not always very good at specifying what it is that's going to be included in the product. But service quality with a small q simply means that what came out of the process is actually what we specified. Whereas service quality with a large q is basically saying that the customer experience equal the customer expectation. So again, it's a link to output versus outcome. So I'll be looking at that. And a key question that's often, even in the economics profession, is, well, is productivity measured by outputs or outcomes? So even though you produce lots of widgets, out of the end of a process, and that was highly productive, you've constantly increased those outputs. But what happens if the outcomes are getting worse? So that's one of the big challenges in the services sector. So organization collaboration therefore needs something broader than the other elements of collaboration that we spoke about between team collaboration and inter-team collaboration. Now we're looking at kind of the whole organization collaboration. So I'll be introducing tools such as the Agile Business Execution Canvas, which is a coherence framework. So at the bottom of that framework, you have the standard kind of enablers, the core platform capabilities for any organization. What's our leadership and how well is that leadership distributed throughout the organization? Again, because we're talking about a network in a service organization and not just a hierarchy. Making sure and looking at, what's the mission and the purpose, what's the vision, what's the principles, what kind of values and behaviors are we planning to cultivate? And how well are we going to deploy our strategy to make the organization successful? And you'll see there are numbers or percentages on these things. So the ability to be able to look and assess your organization, and we'll be looking at some tools that help you do that. The Agile Business Execution has 5 pillars, and the first pillar on the right-hand side is what we call the understand pillar. So how well do we understand who our customers are and what it is that they want? So what are the things that they must have? What are the things that we must not do, otherwise we get fired? How do we delight the customer? And then, the top level is how can we anticipate what customers want or what the market wants? So that's the first key pillar. And we can assess and look at this in the program about how well does your organization do those things. But even if you do that really, really well, the next step is to articulate those insights about the customers throughout the organization, internally, across the supply chain, as we call it. In other words, if you've got partners who are involved in delivering your services, are they as well briefed as the people are internally? And then externally to the market, are we doing what we say we do? So what are we saying to our customers? What are we saying to our markets? And how well do we communicate that? And does it align with what we actually do? The middle pillar is the design process, or the design pillar. And again, as I said earlier, service organizations are very poor at designing things. We tend to have things evolve, to fix problems, and incrementally things evolve, that we don't necessarily design things. So what's the social system? How are we going to work together as a group of people? What behaviors do we want? How are we going to reward people? How do people get claps on the back? Do you get claps on the back for being the super project hero, or do you get a clap on the back for your collaboration skills? The economic system. So most organizations have an economic underpinning, even in the private sector, even in the public sector. So it's really important that the economics of the organization make sense and achieve the kind of economic outputs that are required, even if that's only working within budgets. And then there's the technical system. How do we design the processes and the digital platforms that's going to enable us to be able to deliver the services, the products and services that are going to meet those customer requirements that we've identified in the understand pillar. The next pillar then is the operational. How do we operationalize that design? And if we look at the bottom, the first step in operationalization and service operations is control. Are we in control? If you've ever learned how to ski, you'll know that the first thing you're taught is how to snowplow. And snowplow is basically the ability to be able to stop and turn safely without killing either yourself or other people. So being in control, having those levers of control is key to having a team or an organization that is operationally advanced. And then effectiveness. Are we doing the right things? So effectiveness always comes first. And then how do we do those things in an agile fashion? Um, and then on top of that then comes efficiency. So how do we balance the resources that we need against our ability to be able to do the right things, but most importantly to be able to keep agile, because it's very easy to become very, very efficient, but also very, very rigid. And then when a surprise kind of hits us, we don't have the ability to be able to respond. So control, effectiveness, agility, efficiency, and then we want to automate those good practices. We don't want to automate bad practices. So having put those core operational capabilities in place, we then look at automation. And automation and digitalization is not necessarily the same thing. So we look at that and look at how that fits in. And finally, there's the adapt pillar. So we understand what customers important to customers. We've communicated it in a wide variety of ways. We've designed a set of solutions. We've operationalized that design. Now we need to monitor that and see, well, just how well is that system that we've created so far working really, really well. And nobody has ever designed a complex system that is perfect. So as part of that monitoring, we want to learn how well is it performing, and in that learning, we then move on to how can we improve it, and from improving it, then we look at, well, is this just incremental improvement, or do we need to actually adapt our working environment? And obviously, the COVID crisis that we're in at the moment is an example of organizations need to adapt. And then the next stage is to innovate. How do we innovate to be able to meet with that anticipation that we're talking about on the other side with, the customer needs and requirements? And what's often forgotten is frontline teams are really like innovation scouts. They have a huge opportunity to be able to identify opportunities for the organization to innovate, to meet customer needs, and we'll be looking at that. And all of these things can be measured. We can identify the gaps. We can look at some scores and come up with an overall ABEX score that looks at, well, how well is the organization performing against this kind of criteria? And then how often do we revisit those kind of things? Do we do it once a year? So the score in the middle there is a 1, or do we do it 365? Do we do it every day? Are we constantly looking at, who are our customers? What do they want? How well are we communicating it internally? How well are we operationalizing it? How well are we monitoring and adapting it? So that iterative approach is what gives us the agility and the ability to be able to respond to changes in the business environment. So fundamentally, what does that come down to? Well, it comes down to, service operations management is the science and the discipline of developing the skills, knowledge, and insights required to create the data and information that's necessary to manage effectively and efficiently while collaborating to cohere the organization and meet the organization's missions, goal, vision, objectives, and so on. So is service operations management the same as lean? It's a question that's often asked, and the answer is no. So if we look at kind of layers of organization sophistication, the bottom or foundational layer is as a management team is to understand that the organization we're working in is a complex system. It requires a systems thinking approach. It requires an understanding of complexity science. So these are fundamental basic requirements that we need to build as a capability within the organization. Service organizations and service operations management rather, they're the fundamental core skill sets. I mean, this is like, can you drive a car? Do you know how to start it and stop it and steer it? These are the core levers of control. It's an absolute requirement for every team, for every person, and ultimately for the organization to build that. And then lean enterprise excellence is kind of a wraparound. Lean is almost like advanced service operations management, where you're moving on to that next frontier of improving things in a holistic sense. But in many cases, lean depends on the fact that service operations management is actually in place. Lean grew out of the manufacturing sector, but the manufacturing sector was making things long before lean ever came along. The manufacturing sector was making things really, really well in high volumes, for a couple of 100 years before lean came along. Lean is a relatively new management innovation in the scheme of things, and service operations is a new skill set. And often what's happened is people have jumped straight to lean without putting these fundamental capabilities in place. So these are core skills, and as we'll demonstrate as we go through the program, once they're in place, the ability to move on and become an advanced, high-performing organization is a really achievable objective. So listen, my name is Alex McDonald. I'm the program leader. My background is I kind of grew up in the software and hardware industry as a software and hardware engineer for a number of years with Ericsson's. And I've worked in SMEs and many multinational organizations such as Dell and Ericsson's and Aeronocom. And I've been I've worked at the level of a team member or team leader, and also right the way up to CEO. I've been fortunate enough to found 3 organizations and sold off 2 of them to large PLCs. I've been 20 years as a practitioner and a consultant working in healthcare, public sector, government, banking, insurance, technology, etc. And along the way, I've tried to educate myself as best I can. So I have a BA in management, an MBA, a master's in lean enterprise excellence with a master black belt certification. And a diploma in systems thinking from MIT. So listen, I'm really interested in spreading the word, in encouraging people to build this competence, this capability, because 70% of the world is driven by service and knowledge work organizations, whether it be in the public sector or the private sector. So upskilling our people, delivering better services is really important to society, to our economies, and really looking forward to having you guys on board. So listen, take care and thanks a million.